Greetings, fellow humans. My name is Alasdair Lord and I am the Renaissance Yorkshireman. Today I'm giving a presentation entitled Postcapitalism, What It Is and Why It's Important. And this will take approximately 1 hour and it's for the York Festival of Ideas 2021. And really what I want to do today is tell you two stories. The first story is how I came to write my book, The Tao of Sustainable Development, a New Post-Capitalist Paradigm. And the second story is about a potential beautiful human future, which I call post-capitalism. So, if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. The first story begins in 1984, and the world was a very different place back then. I lived in England, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, the miners' strike was going on, no one had mobile phones, there was no internet. The world was a very different place. And I used to sit next to this boy who was quite conservative and I was more sort of liberal lefty, and we used to argue about politics sometimes in the way that 12-year-olds do, i.e. without very much information or knowledge. And I remember I was saying something along the lines of capitalism's bad this, capitalism's bad that, capitalism's oppressive, blah, blah, blah. And he said to me, what would you do? What would you do? And I thought to myself, what would I do instead of capitalism? And approximately 28 and a half years later, I sat down to write my book. And 7 years after that, last year in January 2020, I finished that book. And I believe that I've answered that question, what I would do instead of capitalism, and I call it post-capitalism. So, who am I? Well, as I said, my name is Alasdair Lord. I was an English language teacher for over 20 years. I taught for 8 years in Thailand, 4 years in Oman, more or less 2.5 years in Saudi Arabia, and a year in Spain. I also spent a year in Mexico as a student, and I worked in Holland for 6 months before I went to university. For part of my time in Thailand, I was the Education for Sustainable Development Coordinator for the British Council Thailand, and I co-wrote a book on climate change that was translated into Thai to be used by Thai science and geography teachers. I've also witnessed a military coup in Thailand. I ran from a tsunami in Thailand. I've witnessed a peasant uprising in the south of Mexico. So I've been around and done things. So I'm not just an armchair academic. I've witnessed things going on in the world. Why is post-capitalism important? Well, I think we all know that we are in a time of great change. And this change has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. And I also believe that we need to start from first principles, because we often bring many assumptions with us when we start from particular systems such as capitalism or socialism or anarchism, and often these assumptions are based on poor evidence and they are incorrect. So we need to examine our assumptions and start from first principles. And I think it's also clear to see that late stage capitalism is failing. There's a rise in populism, there's conflict and wars in many parts of the world, there's increasing polarization, particularly on social media, and our systems are not fit for purpose as they stand. So before I get into the main part of the presentation, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some necessary background. So firstly, I'm going to talk about planetary boundaries and why they're important. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the 5 capitals framework. And the 5 capitals framework is important not only because it helps us understand what is going wrong with capitalism, but also it gives us a framework for understanding how we can do things differently from capitalism in post-capitalist systems. Then I'll talk about the philosophy of late-stage capitalism, how it naturally flows from their ordering of the 5 capitals framework. Then I'll talk about some of the philosophy of post-capitalist systems and how it comes naturally from a different ordering of the 5 capitals framework. So, planetary boundaries, what are they? They are a type of carrying capacity. Now, the UN has recognised 9 different planetary boundaries, but there is a proposed 10th. And the planetary boundaries are 1. Stratospheric ozone depletion. 2. Loss of biosphere integrity and biodiversity loss and extinctions. 3. Chemical pollution and the release of novel entities. 4. Climate change. 5. Ocean acidification. 6. Freshwater consumption and the global hydrological cycle. 7. Land system change. 8. Nitrogen and phosphorus flow to the biosphere and oceans. 9. Atmospheric aerosol loading. And the 10th proposed boundary is plastic in the environment. And the important thing to understand about the planetary boundaries is they are physical realities which exist outside of any choices that we humans make. So any socio-economic system that we create and work with has to be below the carrying capacity of these planetary boundaries. And it doesn't really matter what the system is. It could be capitalism, communism, socialism, anarchism, libertarianism, post-capitalism, any other ism. If they are overshooting one or more of these planetary boundaries in the medium to long term, at the very minimum, there will be a degradation of the natural environment. But if we're overshooting more than half in the medium to long term, it could be that there is a complete environmental collapse and a catastrophic collapse in the human population. Now, I don't want to be a doom monger. I'm not saying that this will happen, but it is a distinct possibility amongst several. And the more planetary boundaries we overshoot for a longer period of time, the more chance there is of it happening. So the 5 capitals framework. Before I get into it, it's really important to say that the order in which we rank them is absolutely of critical importance. I also want to say that there are some objections to the use of the term natural capital, and I understand these objections, and in essence what they're saying is it's disrespectful to planet Earth, our mother, the planet which nourishes us. And I understand these objections, but I'm quite happy to use the term natural capital because the 5 capitals framework is an incredibly useful economic tool for understanding the human condition. Before I dive into the ordering of the 5 capitals framework by ideological late-stage capitalism, I just want to say a little bit about this term that I'm using, ideological late-stage capitalism. So I've chosen late-stage capitalism partly because I believe it's factually accurate. We are in the late stages of capitalism, but also because it's less value-laden than a term like, say, disaster capitalism. And I've added the word ideological because it's obvious to me that many of the people who argue in favour of capitalism are ideologists. They are not basing their arguments on evidence. So the ordering of the 5 capitals framework under ideological late-stage capitalism. Number 1 and most important, financial capital. 2 and 3, natural capital and manufactured capital. Number 4, human capital. Number 5, social capital. So what do these terms mean? Well, financial capital is any kind of money. So it could be the notes in your wallet, it could be the electronic numbers in your bank account that's held in a computer somewhere, it could be stocks and shares. Natural capital is the natural environment. Manufactured capital is infrastructure, houses, bridges, technology, things like that. Human capital is about the skills and mental health of individual. Although social capital is about relationships between individuals, it's so much more than that. It's the festivals that you might go to in the summer. It's the restaurants and the bars in your neighbourhood. It's about parent and teacher associations. It's about bumping into people and having random conversations in the street or in the park. So social capital is many, many things. You could argue somewhat between the way that I've ordered ideological late-stage capitalism's version of the 5 capitals framework, but I would argue that absolutely financial capital comes first and social capital comes last. In contrast, post-capitalist systems rank the 5 capitals framework thus: first, natural capital; second and third, human and social capital; fourth, manufactured capital; fifth. So what is some of the philosophy that logically comes from this different ordering of the five capitals framework? Well, I would argue that under ideological late-stage capitalism, their philosophy goes something like this. States and transnational corporations are the building blocks of the economic system and therefore also of society. Massive wealth inequality is justified. Poverty, malnutrition and homelessness is normal. Debt-based currencies are taken for granted, and I'll talk about debt-based currencies and not debt-based currencies in some detail in the second part of the presentation. The military-industrial complex is a reasonable business and a reasonable way to make money. The so-called war on drugs is both justified and necessary. A media owned by oligarchs and billionaires is normal. Corruption is endemic. And I would argue that ideological late-stage capitalism is fundamentally dishonest about these assumptions. It doesn't come out and state explicitly, this is our ordering of the five capitals framework. It does it implicitly, and it very rarely recognises what really is its fundamental philosophy. In contrast, the philosophy of post-capitalist systems is quite different. Firstly, systems matter. Some systems are better than other systems. It's that simple. Not all systems are created equal. Rights and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin. Self-actualization is a responsibility to the self and to society at large. You have the right to freedom from poverty, the right to peace, the right to a healthy environment. Under post-capitalism, people would have the right to live in non-state forms and the right to cognitive freedom. What do I mean by cognitive freedom? Well, if you're an adult of sound mind and you've found out the necessary information, you've appraised yourselves of the possible dangers and pitfalls of changing your consciousness with mind-altering drugs, such as alcohol, opium, magic mushrooms, the list is almost endless. But if you know the dangers and you choose to do this yourself, then the state shouldn't have the right to interfere with you. So in certain respects, this is the opposite of the war on drugs. And there's a huge amount of evidence, particularly from the Portuguese and Dutch model of legalisation / decriminalisation, that when we legalise or decriminalise drugs, society benefits. It's a win-win for society. And finally, under post-capitalist systems, individuals have the responsibility to change themselves, because we all have stuff going on in our head. I mean, I know I do, and presumably you do too. Well, go and sort it out, no one's going to sort it out for you. And now the main part of the presentation, post-capitalism. What is it? So in my book, I talk about there being 5 minimum characteristics of post-capitalism. So sustainable agriculture and animal husbandry, renewable energy and resource management, individual and collective psychological freedom or collective psychological change, functional states and non-state forms, and holistic education. Now, quite simply, given the time constraints of this presentation, I can't talk about all of them. So what I'm choosing to do is just talk about 2 of them: individual and collective psychological freedom and functional states and non-state forms. And just to talk about some of the key issues of those 2 things. But in essence, what I'm saying with there being 5 minimum characteristics is, if we can tick all 5 boxes, we will have a sustainable system. If we fail to tick 1 or more, we won't. What I'm going to talk about specifically is psychopathy, the military-industrial complex, because that naturally flows from psychopathy, electoral reforms in state-based societies, debt-based currencies, and one possible solution to debt-based currencies, which is called Copiosis. And finally, I'm going to talk about non-state forms. Now, before I get into psychopathy, I'd just like to mention a little bit about game theory and strategies, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I do have videos on my website which do explain these in more detail, if you're interested. So first of all, it's important to distinguish between nasty strategies or Machiavellian strategies and nice strategies. So nasty strategies are what a con man would use. They're trying to get something from someone else without giving something in return. Nice strategies, in contrast, such as direct reciprocity or tit for tat, as it's sometimes known, is I do you a favour, you do me a favour, I do you a favour, you do me a favour. And one of the important things to note about nasty strategies and nice strategies is, first of all, nice strategies are much simpler than nasty strategies. Machiavellian strategies, nasty strategies, are by their nature complex. They're Machiavellian. They need planning and plotting, and they often involve groups of people conspiring together. Nice strategies, on the other hand, are simple and straightforward. And when more humans are employing nice strategies more frequently, society at large gains, and inequality within societies tends to be lower. There are also zero-sum games, win-win games, and lose-lose games. So a zero-sum game might be, for example, I bet you £10 it will rain tomorrow. It rains tomorrow, you give me £10, you lose £10. So 10 minus 10 is 0. It's a zero-sum game. One possible example of a win-win game is when Dan Price raised the minimum wage in his company to $70,000. Now, a lot of people told him not to do this, but productivity rose in his company. The company made more money, they sold more products, so the company gained, the employees of the company gained, and society at large gained. It's a win-win situation. An example of a lose-lose situation would be a drug dealer. He decides to cut his heroin with fentanyl. It's too strong. Some of the people who buy it overdose and die. Those people are dead. Their families are negatively impacted. The police then have to put more resources and time and effort into catching the criminal. The criminal is caught. He goes to prison for 25 years. It's lose, lose, lose. One of the things we're trying to do with post-capitalist systems is to shift the balance away from lose-lose games to win-win games. And that brings us on to the nature of psychopathy. So when I'm talking about psychopathy, I'm not only talking about clinical psychopaths, who are defined as people who score 27 or more out of 40 on the Hare psychopathy checklist. I'm also talking about people who are scoring substantially more than average, but less than clinical psychopaths. Classic psychopaths, if they're of low intelligence and have poor impulse control and are poorly connected, they will get caught doing whatever their activity is, whether it's murder, beating people up, rape. They'll tend to be caught and put in prison. But some psychopaths are very intelligent, and some psychopaths have good impulse control, some don't, some do, and some are very well connected. The main point to note here is that psychopaths can have an extremely disproportionate effect on societies, particularly state-based societies. Psychopaths can also infect other people and systems. So I'll give you an example of someone infecting systems. So if you've seen The Wolf of Wall Street, you'll have a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about. Now, this is based on a true story about Jordan Belfort. Now, he started a company, and essentially he was giving permission to other people to steal. Now, you could argue about this use of the term steal, because, if you buy stocks and shares, you know that there's a chance that you could lose your money. We know that some of these people are substantially more dishonest than others. So, because the people in his employ could see that essentially he was taking in money from people and sticking it in his own pocket, they did the same thing. So psychopaths can infect systems. Another important point is that psychopaths tend to favour positions with power. So, for example, politics, the legal profession, religion, the police force, banking, the private sector, high up in companies, because this often allows them to get away with things substantially easier than if they were in day-to-day professions, such as being an electrician or a plumber or a teacher, for example. They're also underrepresented in the caring professions. So with childcare, for example, you're very unlikely to encounter someone with high psychopathic tendencies, whereas in politics or the legal profession, it's much more common. And I'd just like to read you a quote. And this quote is from Hare and Babiak in their book, Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work. And they say, psychopaths need considerable novel stimulation, and their need for stimulation is reflected in a penchant for high-risk, thrill-seeking behaviour. Sadly for society, the psychopath's need for stimulation easily shades into antisocial and criminal behaviour. Now, the important thing to note here is that psychopathy exists. It's not going away. But if we don't recognise the impacts, the very real impacts it can have on society, and the way that within capitalism, Machiavellian and nasty strategies tend to favour psychopathy and psychopathic behaviour, if we don't recognise this, we're going to have problems. But it's not all bad news, because there is such a thing as pro-social psychopaths. In his book, The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain, Dr. James Fallon discusses this phenomena because he found out from brain scans that he had the same brain makeup as a psychopath. But there are key differences between pro-social psychopaths and classic psychopaths. And that is, pro-social psychopaths have been socialised in a nurturing family while growing up. So they don't become murderers, assassins and hitmen. Now, I would argue that Roy Keane and Sir Alex Ferguson are both pro-social psychopaths. Now, this is partly because I'm a Man United fan, but also I think when you look at their drive and their behaviour, you can see that they share many traits with psychopaths. And we can term this selective psychopathy. So not all traits of psychopaths are negative. There are some which are extremely positive. So, for example, many people with selective psychopathy can drop into the flow state on command. And that's an incredibly useful skill in all sorts of professions. There's a number of points here. The first one is that with classic psychopaths, we need to identify them and either incarcerate them in prisons or in secure mental hospitals. Absolutely, we do not want them in government. We've seen what happens when psychopaths get in government. Stalin, Chairman Mao, Pol Pot. I mean, the list is almost endless, unfortunately. The second point is that those people who are pro-social psychopaths or have selective psychopathy, whichever way you want to put it, they get bored easily. We need to give them entertaining and positive tasks that will add to social capital rather than take it away. And this will depend on the individual. It might be sport, it might be music, it might be art, it could be something else. But the point is, we need to identify who they are and give them positive tasks to be getting on with. And another point here is that if family units are more positive because there's less stress as a general rule in society, then less psychopaths will be created in the first instance, because the evidence seems to indicate that psychopaths are created from a particular genetic predisposition coupled with abuse in childhood. And talking about psychopathy naturally leads us to the military-industrial complex. And I'd just like to start with a couple of figures. So this first figure is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and according to them, in 2020, global spending on the arms trade was just under $2 trillion. If you're not sure what $2 trillion is, it's a 2 with 12 zeros after it. So, $2,000,000,000,000,000,000 $2 trillion. A mind-bogglingly huge amount of money. It's fair to say that it's not a king's ransom. It's not even dozens of king's ransoms or hundreds of king's ransoms. It's thousands or even tens of thousands of king's ransoms. Just a mind-bogglingly stupid amount of money. And what's it going on? So the arms trade is things like what? Kalashnikovs, landmines, tanks, Stinger missiles, handguns, nuclear submarines, nuclear weapons, Trident missiles and torture equipment. Let's not kid ourselves. The part of the money that goes into the military-industrial complex is deliberately there to create equipment for torturing human beings. Let's have another figure. This one comes from former African National Congress MP Andrew Feinstein from his 2010 book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. And according to him, in 2001, $1.1 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget. I mean, this is absolutely staggering amount of money. The thing about money disappearing from military budgets, especially a figure as big as $1.1 trillion, which simply can't be accounted for, is it doesn't just vanish in a puff of smoke. It's not like gremlins or ghosts or something are coming in and stealing the money from the computers. On the balance of probability, what's happening is that money is going to private bank accounts in places like Switzerland, Panama, the Cayman Islands, places with extreme banking secrecy. And the people who own those bank accounts, where that $1.1 trillion disappeared to, those people have names and addresses. You know, they are real people. And here's one of the key points about the arms trade, is not only is it destructive for the natural environment and to people and society, it's also inherently corrupt. So much of the money in the arms trade, it just keeps disappearing from official budgets. And this absolutely is the norm. And this is the case all over the world. The military-industrial complex is justified with fear. Now, when I was a teenager, it was communist Russians. When I was in my 20s, it was Islamicists. These days, it's a multitude of different actors. Sometimes it's the Russians, although now they're not communists, or sometimes it's the Chinese, who are sort of communist in name, certainly. Or in some cases, it's narcotraficantes, because they need weapons to protect themselves from the police and the army. Or in other cases, it's terrorists of some different stripe or other. Could be some sort of ethnic terrorist, religious terrorist, or political terrorist. And let's not forget that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But my point here is that although the script, the narrative of who is the enemy, who is this outside threat changes, there's always some kind of narrative that there is a threat coming from them to you. And this is to keep a certain level of fear so that the spending on the military-industrial complex can be justified. So what is the alternative to the military-industrial complex? Well, I would argue that it's the peace dividend. Now, if we reduce over, say, the next 5 years, the military budget by 90%, all those resources can become available for other things, such as education, health, cleaning up our polluted oceans, tackling the plastic problem. And perhaps after 5 years, when the planet's population look and think, actually, things are a lot better now, why don't we carry on decreasing the size of the military-industrial complex? Then everything can change, because the resources to tackle our problems are there. It's just that so many of them are going into the military-industrial complex. And before I end on this particular point, there's just two more things I'd like to talk about. One is the self-defense principle. Now, I absolutely believe that people have the right to defend themselves, and countries do too. You know, if you're walking down the street and someone attacks you with a gun or a knife, you absolutely have the right to defend yourself. But the military-industrial complex and the arms trade as it currently exists is nothing to do with defence. It's all to do with oppression, resources and empire. And my final point is about the army and social capital. So, although I propose getting rid of the military-industrial complex as it currently exists, I don't propose getting rid of the army, because the army can be useful in many ways and it can build social capital under some circumstances. So there's a certain type of young man who responds very well to the discipline of the army, and we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it has to be an army done in a particular way, an army that is subservient to a truly democratic system. Now, exactly how this would work, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. But I do believe that there is the possibility of having an army that adds to social capital without having a military-industrial complex. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about electoral politics in states. I'm going to use the example of the United Kingdom because I'm from the United Kingdom and it's the system that I know most about. But these ideas could apply to any country that's having some form of representative democracy. Now, we can't assume that that will be the case. Other systems are available. But as a general rule, representative democracy, when done well, does seem to be a less bad option than most of the other systems available, such as military dictatorships or kingdoms. So I'm proposing that there are 4 changes to the voting system. The first one is that we have single transferable vote instead of first past the post. My second proposal is that on the ballot there should always be an option of vote for Ron, reopen nominations, or nota, none of the above. My third proposal is that there is compulsory voting, but a half-day holiday be given so that people can go and vote, and if they choose not to vote, then they don't get a free half-day holiday. And my fourth proposal is that the House of Lords be replaced by a house selected by sortition. And sortition is the random selection by lot of representatives, and it's a system which dates back to ancient Greece. Now here's the problem as I see it. Since the end of the Second World War, consistently only between about 60 and 70% of the electorate have voted. Now I think there's only been 1 or 2 elections since the Second World War where more than 70% have voted. But consistently about 1/3 of the electorate do not vote. Now in my lifetime, the Conservative Party have won most of the elections, and they've won it with the first past the post system. So usually when they've won elections in my lifetime, they've got between about 38 and 45% of the vote, but they've achieved around about 55 to 60% of the seat. Now, if they have more than 50% of the seat, they have an overall majority. But if they're only getting about 40% of the electorate's votes, but 1/3 of people don't vote, then that's only in the range of about 28, 29% of the actual electorate are voting for the Conservative Party, and yet they're consistently getting an overall majority of 55% or more. Now, we are told that this constitutes representative democracy. Well, I have to say, in my view, this is a poor system and we can do a lot better. And post-capitalist systems aim to deliver a far better representative democracy than currently exists in the UK and indeed in most other countries. So I'll explain what first past the post is, I'll explain alternative vote, and I'll explain single transferable vote. And the reason I'm going to explain alternative vote is because it's very similar to single transferable vote, and it's easier for me to explain that first and then go on to single transferable vote. Before I get into that though, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the evidence. The Electoral Reform Society have done extensive research and they've ranked 10 different systems. They've ranked them from 3 different criteria, they ranked them out of 5. So the first criteria is proportionality, then there's voter choice, and then there's local representation. Now, First past the post is scoring 2 for proportionality, 2 for voter choice, and 3 for local representation. So 7 out of a possible 15. Alternative vote is scoring 2, 3, 4. So a possible 9 out of 15. And single transferable vote is scoring 4, 5, 5. So it's scoring 14 out of a possible 15, and of the 10 systems that the Electoral Reform Society look at, single transferable vote comes out on top. So I'm not supporting single transferable vote because I have some kind of emotional attachment to it. No, I'm going with the evidence. And with post-capitalist systems, we should always be going with the evidence. So in first past the post, you would have a ballot which looks something like this. And you tick one box for your preferred candidate. Very simple, like this. Then all the votes are counted. The person who gets the most votes is elected to that seat. Very simple. With alternative vote, your ballot paper looks the same, but instead of ticking one box, you number them in the number you prefer them. So if you think nobody deserves your vote, then you would vote like this. But if you think at least one of the candidates is a good candidate and is worthy of your vote, then you might vote something like this. So you're ordering your candidates how you prefer them. First of all, we count all the number 1 votes. If any candidate has 50% of the vote or more to begin with, they are elected. If nobody has 50% of the vote, we get rid of the person who came 5th and we redistribute their vote according to their number 2 preferences. If anyone has 50% of the vote, they're elected. If not, we eliminate candidate number 4. We redistribute their vote. If anyone has 50% of the vote, they are elected. If not, we get rid of candidate number 3, redistribute their votes. There's only 2 candidates left. The one with the most votes is elected to that seat. So it's a very simple system. You just number your candidates how you prefer them. Single transferable vote is similar. We number the candidates in a similar way. However, what happens here is instead of having lots of small constituencies, we have larger constituencies. So there might be 5 people elected for 1 seat. So in the last case, there could be 5 Conservative candidates, 5 Labour candidates, 5 Liberal Democrat candidates, 5 Green candidates, and 5 independent candidates, all standing in one larger area. So in that case, you would have 25 people on the ballot, plus none of the above. But you rank your candidates the same, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, as many as you like. And we do it in the same way, except now we're trying to get to a quota. But we eliminate anyone who comes last, we redistribute their votes. When we have 5 people who reach the quota, we have our 5 candidates for that area. So although it's slightly more complex than alternative vote, it's still not that complicated. You just number your candidates how you prefer them. And according to the evidence, it is the single best system for representative democracy. My second proposal is that every ballot should always have the option of vote for Ron, reopen nominations, or nota, none of the above. What this means is you're sending a message to the electoral system and to the candidates that you're saying these candidates are not good enough. None of them deserve my vote. If nota or Ron gets the most votes, then there is no legitimacy of any of the candidates and nobody is elected. Now, ideally, we don't want this situation happening. However, it does send a message to politicians. You're not good enough. I will not be taken for granted. And politicians should not be taking votes for granted. They should be earning our vote if representative democracy is to be worth its salt. Third, compulsory voting. Now, as I said earlier, at the moment, approximately a third of people are not voting. We should be aiming to get at least 90% of people voting. If more than 90% of people vote, I think it's fair to say that is genuine representative democracy. But with a third of people not voting, I really don't believe that it is. And if we make the offer of you get a free half-day holiday, most people will go and vote. Now, If you're not satisfied with the system, you have the option of vote for Ron or Nota. But if you don't want to do that and you really don't want to turn up, you can still choose to not vote. You just won't get a free half-day holiday. So my next proposed change is that the House of Lords be abolished and we replace it with a House of Commoners that is selected through sortition. What is sortition? It's an idea that dates back to ancient Greece, and it is the random selection by lot of individuals to be representatives. So in this case, with the UK having approximately 70 million people, one person would be selected at random per 100,000 people. So that would be 700 people in a House of Commoners selected by sortition. So there are three main reasons for using sortition. The first is that it is a good representation of society at large. So you're going to normally get 50% men, 50% women. You're going to get a good reflection of ethnic minorities within society, and you're going to get a wide difference of opinions in that group. A second reason is that no single party can dominate, because it's not an elected house. Now, that may or may not happen in the House of Commons, but in a house selected by sortition, it cannot happen. And the primary reason is to get a much better decision making, because you've got a much wider range of views. Because as things stand in most countries, the political class is very narrow, and it's generally overrepresented by one or two ethnic groups. It's generally overrepresented by men, and it's generally overrepresented by rich people. Not always, there are exceptions, but as a general rule. So some people might make the argument against sortition, something along the lines of, you wouldn't select your doctor or your bus driver by random lot, so why do it with politicians? Well, I'd like to quote Brett Hennig from his 2017 book, The End of Politicians. Hennig says this: "We would not choose a pilot or surgeon by random selection, so the common analogy goes. So why choose our legislators this way? As Dahl points out, however, this analogy is based on fallacious ideas of the linkages between expert knowledge, competence, and the role of government. Government and its officials, especially the police and the military, are the only institutions lawfully allowed to use force to compel coercion of their decisions. When people defer to experts to fly planes or perform surgery, they have the option to accept or reject their advice and cannot be forced to submit to the expert's decision, up to the point where we get on the plane or administered the anaesthetic." Hennig further expands on this point when he says, "There is a fundamental difference between delegating subordinate decisions, over which we have ultimate control, to experts, and handling over responsibility for state power, which will have authority over us. Dahl and most other deliberate Democrats further point out that governing does not require strictly scientific knowledge or technical knowledge. The fundamentals of allocating finite resources between competing demands are essentially moral decisions." So there's a couple of points to pick up on here. The first is that politics is not rocket science. Whatever politicians or economists may tell you, it is not a science. It's just that simple. And the allocation of resources is, in the first instance, it's a moral decision rather than a scientific decision. But there's still the argument that some people are just not that well educated or just don't know that much about how things work. Well, as a general rule, if you give people responsibility to make decisions like that, they will empower themselves. And it's not like we would simply throw these people into the fray with no support. Of course, if you're going to have a house of sortition, they have to have access to experts in different fields. So for example, if they're debating about nuclear power, experts can come in and say, these are the advantages of nuclear power. Now, when I say experts, I mean, people who have master's degrees, PhDs in that field, people who have worked in that field for a long time. They can have other people in the same field coming and saying, these are the disadvantages of nuclear power. They can then sit in small groups, maybe 6 or 8 people. They can discuss it together, the advantages and the disadvantages with evidence. Because a house of sortition is not going to work if the people in it don't have access to quality evidence and are not able to discuss it in a reasonable manner together. And as a general rule, people would spend probably about 2 to 3 years as representatives. Again, what I've just talked about with these changes does not represent a perfect system, because no perfect system exists. However, the evidence is with me, and if we're going to build new systems that are better than the ones we had before, we have to look at the evidence. And with post-capitalist systems, evidence comes before ideology. Debt-based currencies. First, I'd like to start by reading you a quote. And this comes from Thomas Greco's 2001 book, Money: Understanding and Creating Alternatives to Legal Tender. And he says, "It is generally believed that money is created by the government, but here is the simple truth. Today, money takes the form of bank credit that must be borrowed into circulation. Money is the product of a private banking cartel. The main point that needs to be understood is that in order for money to come into circulation, someone must go into debt to a bank. Since banks charge interest on all this debt, and since the money to pay the interest can only come from further debt, debt grows like a cancer within the global economic body. This debt imperative creates a growth imperative that is forcing us to destroy the life support systems of the planet." So I'll give you a concrete example of this nature of debt-based currencies. Apparently today, Jeff Bezos is the richest man on planet Earth, and he's worth approximately $200 billion. What that might mean is that 2 billion people are $100 in debt so that Jeff Bezos can have $200 billion. And let's be in no doubt that the complexity of the financial system as it currently exists today is there in part so that bankers and financiers can justify their existence, they can justify their jobs, they can justify the huge bonus payments that they get. But let's not forget that these people who work at these big trading companies and banks, when their companies go bust, they don't end up paying back the bonuses. But money is also complex to a certain degree so that we can facilitate corrupt financial transactions such as bribe payments and money laundering. But there are alternatives to debt-based currencies. There are systems which are non-debt-based currencies, and one of those is called Copiosis. So what are the alternatives to debt-based currency? Well, Copiosis is one possible alternative. Now, it may be that other alternatives exist, but Copiosis is something that I've investigated. Now, it's a type of virtual currency. It's not controlled by a banking cartel, and it's not controlled by the government. NBR, Net Benefit Reward, is created by a payer organisation. And as I say, this is independent of the government and it's independent of banks. It's created for any positive action. It's created without debt. It's non-transferable. It's destroyed once it's spent. So let me explain that. So if you're doing some kind of positive action, you're a fisherman, you're bringing in fish, you get awarded a certain amount of NBR for the fish that you bring in. If you're a carpenter, you create tables and chairs, you get awarded a certain amount of NBR for doing that positive action. If you're a parent bringing up a child, you can be awarded NBR because that is a positive thing for society. If you're a teacher, you're awarded NBR because that's a positive thing for society. If you're making landmines and Kalashnikovs and your society determines that this is not positive, you don't get rewarded for those actions. So who decides what's positive and what isn't? Well, there's a payer organisation, as I mentioned earlier, and anyone can join this. And They will have meetings and an algorithm is programmed, and anyone can see how it's programmed and what the decisions have been made that lead to particular levels of NBR being paid for one profession and for a different profession. So it's transparent from the get-go. So if you don't think that something is fair, you could join the payer organisation and you could help change how it's determined how much NBR is paid for a particular action. Now, when I say it's non-transferable and it's destroyed once spent, so for example, in the case of a carpenter, let's say they produce a table with 4 chairs and they are paid a certain amount of NBR by the payer organisation. Someone comes along and they buy that table and chairs. So their NBR that's paid for the table and chairs is just destroyed. It goes out of existence. It doesn't go to the carpenter who made them because the carpenter has already been paid. Now, I can hear some of you are thinking something along the lines of A, that sounds like communism, and B, you're just making it up out of thin air. Well, I'll come to the second one first. Yes, it is making it up out of thin air, but that's exactly what happens in the system we have now. Pounds, dollars, euros, any other current currency, they are not linked to gold and silver. They only have value because enough people have trust in the system. Now, if enough people have trust in the system of Copiosis, it will work. I mean, it's that simple because the system we have at the moment goes on trust and it works. Now, to answer the first part, that sounds like communism. Well, under communism, everything's controlled by the government. In a Copiosis system, it's a payer organisation. Anyone can join. It's not controlled by a political party. It's not controlled by the banks. It's not controlled by the government. So NBR is based on an algorithm, and this algorithm can change over time because more information can be added. Food, healthcare, shelter, education is provided free so that people are free to pursue their passions. Well, if people are freed from jobs that they don't want to do, they can pursue their passions and they will naturally enter into the flow state easier. And when people are enjoying themselves and being happy, social capital is strengthened, human capital is strengthened, the system is strengthened overall. And Copiosis is perhaps not a perfect system, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. There is no perfect system out there, but Copiosis comes a lot closer than the debt-based currencies that we use on a daily basis today. Non-state forms. According to the anthropological literature, there are 3 types of non-state form. The smallest is a band of about 6 to 60 people. The second is a tribe of about 60 to 300 people. And the third is a chieftain of about 500 to 5,000 people. Now, although for the last 600 to 700 years or so, more than 99% of humans have lived under the direct control of the state, if we go back further in our Homo sapiens history, back to the Ice Age, for example, for more than 90% of our Homo sapiens history, the vast majority, if not all Homo sapiens, have lived outside the direct control of the state because states did not exist. So for most of our history, we as a species have lived in non-state forms. And I would argue that this means there are some comparative advantages available to humans living in non-states that are not available to humans living under the control of the state. What are some of those advantages? Well, there's no necessity for a formal police force with a legal monopoly on violence. There is no necessity for a bureaucracy. There is no necessity for a formal government because often decision making can be made locally within small groups. Laws and rules can be determined locally, but also I think it's easier to identify individuals with psychopathic tendencies within small groups because in large anonymous cities, for example, they find it easier to hide than when they're in small groups. Now, there's 2 numbers in particular that I'd like to talk about related to non-state forms. And the first is Dunbar's number, which is commonly taken as 150. Now, this number, 150, is named for Professor Robin Dunbar of Durham University, and it's based on research in primate group size and the size of the human neocortex. And what Professor Dunbar says is that any human can know and maintain a personal relationship with 150 people or less. So what that means in terms of small non-states is if you've got a group of, let's say, 120 or smaller, so a small tribe or a band, every individual in that group can know every other individual. And that means that you could have groups which have no money. There might be no need for financial exchange. Everything could be done on the basis of reciprocity. Although I can't prove it, I say that this would represent a huge win for social capital and human capital within those groups. The second number I'm interested in, Plato's number. Now, Plato, 2,500 years ago, more or less, said that he believed that 5,040 was the ideal number for a polis, which was the political unit that he was talking about in some of his writings. Now, if you want to know what's interesting about the number 5,040, have a look on my website. I've got a video about it. But as the anthropological literature says around about 5,000 is the maximum for a non-state form, well, 5,040 is around about 5,000. And if it's good enough for Plato, it's good enough for me. With a group this size, it's impossible for each individual to know every other individual. It's just not possible. However, we can still have the advantages of no police force and no formal government and no bureaucracy, because despite the fact that not everyone knows each other, it's still small enough that those reciprocal relationships can be very strong. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today, and I understand that there's a lot of ideas here to understand. And if you really want to go and explore them, please get a copy of my book. It's available as a paperback or as a Kindle from Amazon. And if there's only 3 ideas that you go away with today, could I suggest that they are the 5 capitals framework, because it's a relatively simple idea. It explains what's going wrong with ideological late-stage capitalism at the moment, but it also shows us where we can change our value system and how we can move forward in the world. Secondly, debt-based currencies and copiosis. We use money on a daily basis, either the cash in our wallet or electronically with cards. But most of us really don't understand how money is created. And if we're going to be serious about tackling poverty, tackling homelessness, and tackling corruption, we can't do it with debt-based currencies. There will always be corruption and be poverty with debt-based currencies. It is simply unavoidable. Now, I'm not saying that changing to non-debt-based currencies will solve all these problems automatically, but it is a prerequisite for solving these problems. So if we're serious about solving the problems of homelessness and poverty and corruption, we must transition to a system such as Copiosis, or indeed any other system that is non-debt based. And finally, the idea of non-state forms, because despite the fact that for the last more or less 600 or 700 years, more than 99% of humans have lived under the direct control of the state, for the vast majority of our Homo sapiens history, so for more than 90% of our history as a species, we have lived predominantly in non-state forms. And these must confer advantages, such as it's far easier to have reciprocal relationships. It's far easier to identify psychopaths in a small group. It's far easier to have a conscious relationship with the environment, with your family, and with yourself. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace.